Hello. Hello, everyone. Hi. Welcome back from lunch. I hope we're all well fed. I hope we're all excited to spill some tea, EA. Spill some tea. I love that title. Next up, we've got Isha leading a discussion about that counter article from last year, the title of which was Lab Grown Meat is Supposed to Be Inevitable, but the science tells a different story. Suggested that extensive new research suggested that this industry might be on a billion-dollar crash course with reality. And this was based on extensive techno-economic analysis and modeling by Dr. Dave Humbird, and very well reported by Joe Fassler. It started a lot of great conversation in this community, and I'm very excited to just get out of the way and welcome our team to the stage. Please, big round of applause.
Hello. Let's do another big round of applause just to get everyone in here. Woo! Come on in. Yes. All right. I actually wanted to start by asking how many of you don't know who Joe and Dave are. Okay, so 3 people, 4 people. So I actually thought instead of doing intros the old-fashioned way, we might just start by telling a story. And I wanted to ask both of you, how did we end up here on this stage together today?
Who should start?
Maybe me.
Probably Dave.
Yeah. I'm David Humbird, and I'm a chemical engineer based in Colorado, in Denver area. These days, I'm a private consultant. I have been since 2014. I do conceptual process design and techno-economics for small startups. At least that's what I went in my business model to do. These days, I'm more of a flow sheet simulation consultant. I'm pretty much simulation-oriented only. But earlier in my career, in 2008, I joined the National Renewable Energy Lab in Colorado. That's why I moved there. At NREL, because it's part of the DOE. DOE research, DOE-funded research is expected to put out very detailed reports for techno-economic analysis.
DOE being Department of Energy.
The Department of Energy in the US, yeah. So what I learned at NREL was how to write long-form techno-economic analysis, what we call design reports. I did one for cellulosic ethanol. So front to back, biomass collection, pre-treatment, fermentation, distillation, and wrote a whole document describing all of those areas and all the technical challenges and all the economic challenges. So that's where I got my start in TEA. So 2 of my contemporaries, not at NREL, but in the industry, in that field, they knew me and they knew my capacity. And then later, those 2 individuals became the science team at Open Philanthropy. So when they learned that I had gone private, they contacted me to do a study on the economics of cultured meat, whether or not cells from animal culture could reasonably be expected to displace conventional meat from slaughter. Open Phil, if you don't know, were an early investor in Impossible Foods, and that went pretty well for them. And then at some point, cultured meat developers came to them, hat in hand. Can we get some of that? And they wanted someone to tell them what it would look like. So that was what I performed.
Open Philanthropy, in addition to investing, also donates to a lot of different causes and organizations. So they're a great example of this kind of investor and philanthropic org in the space. So in summary, you were a biofuels guy, ended up doing this Selag project. How long did it take? Like, what was the experience of it like?
I was contacted in July of 18. I completed it in December of 2020. The last days of December 2020. So 2.5 years, following 12 years of doing it for a living. It was it was starting from nothing. There was nothing out there to go on. We can get into how I approached it, but yeah, just completely bootstrapped. So it took a long time. And also, you know, it's public. Everything is out there. It's published. My spreadsheet is published. It's 5 megabytes or something. It's a big deal, and it's out there. It's out there to be criticized. You know, I'm vulnerable in that sense, but it's for you guys.
As research should be. But I also wanted to ask, where did the data to inform your TEA come from?
Well, conceptually, the process is based on baker's yeast. So how do we think about economically making any cell? And baker's yeast we make all the time at pretty large volumes. But there are certain things that are different about that kind of process compared to a bioproduct. So I did the best I could. You know, I had to make a lot of assumptions about metabolism, attainable cell density, capital costs, operating costs. You know, I'm pretty good at those things. Those are okay. But in the end, you look to CHO because CHO cell lines are by mass the most animal cells that anyone's ever made. There's not really a lot to learn there. You can learn something about CHO metabolism. It's quickly shown that that's inefficient as hell. Forget about it. So you have to really make a fiction, a fictional cell line with a metabolism that makes sense at all. So the data came from the literature as much as I could. I got 200-something references in there.
And did you work with industry at all? Or companies at all?
The OpenPhil submitted an early draft for comment. In the early days, sort of like first 6 months or so, we thought about approaching, and I did go meet with some of the companies, the ones that wouldn't sign NDAs. We had determined, Open Philanthropy and myself, we determined that we were going to do this outside of an NDA, and anyone that would talk to us with that condition was welcome to come have input, but those were very few.
Love it. And then, for those who don't know, what were the conclusions of the TEA?
Well, the thing about the design report framework is that you have to describe all of the challenges, and then at some point, have one case that works, right? This is the fiction that works, and this is the story. These are the characters and the development that result in that one case, right? So what success looks like is an incredibly efficient cell line growing on soy hydrolysate, that's about $2 a kilo for mixed amino acids, in a 20,000 liter stainless steel bioreactor, not necessarily larger, and in suspension culture. What that ends up with is a cost of cell mass production that's under $25 per kilo, wet. What I reason is that you take $25 kilo cell mass and upgrade it to some food product, and it's going to double. It's going to get to be about $50 a kilogram, which I had in my mind as something that is consistent with measurable displacement of conventional meat.
I hope everyone is writing that down.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Joe, how did you come to be here?
Yeah, so before the story part, I'll just say I think part of my interest in this topic is very similar to a lot of the people in this room, though I am a storyteller and a journalist, not a scientist or an entrepreneur. As someone who's reported on food and ag issues for a really long time, I'm very steeped in the kind of brokenness of the existing food system as it exists in the U.S. And have long wondered how things might be different. And I think, like many of the people here, I'm captivated and very captivated by and very interested in the kind of radical, disruptive potential of cultured meat, even in concept, right? I mean, even just the sort of idea of it, before getting into the sort of specifics that Dave works on, is radical and mind-bending and leads to some really interesting conversations. In a more specific sense, I, at the time, was working for The Counter, an unfortunately very recently shuttered, nonprofit newsroom devoted to the business, politics, and culture of American food. And I did a piece in May of 2021 when a specific cultured meat company had pledged to have a product out on the market that calendar year. I did not think that was possible based on reporting that I had edited and other work that we had done, just simply due to the regulatory situation. Didn't seem right to me. And so I did a piece essentially saying that it's not going to happen. And when that piece was published, I started to hear from some folks who were telling me things I hadn't heard before, which is that the science is very, very forbidding. And all these specific challenges related to sterility, contamination, scale, growth factors. And my mind was just sort of blown open because, I'd read a lot about cultured meat. I'd read the kind of glossy magazine profiles and think pieces and all this stuff. And I'd never heard any of this before. And so I was asking myself, like, are the people who are telling me this, like, crazy? Do they not know what is going on here? And so I started to kind of do research. And, as Dave said, there's not a lot out there necessarily. New Harvest has done some incredible work. There are others. But when it specifically comes to the kind of production capacity of this technology for human food consumption, there's a lot that's left out. And so I didn't know about Dave's work. It had been published by the time I kind of got onto this tip. And I discovered it sort of midway through. And I had all these questions that, like, I couldn't answer, couldn't begin to answer. And when I discovered Dave's report, it was like, oh my God, here's someone who spent years methodically going through, asking all these questions that I didn't have the training or expertise to even be asking at that point. But it was kind of like a holy grail to me. And just when I discovered that report, I was like, okay, like, this is the most meticulous thing I've read on this subject, period, from anyone. And I went through a similar process of, like, there was no journalism for me to rely on. There was nothing except for Dave and the sources that I had. And so it was this very strange process of being like, when this story comes out, like, what is going to happen? Because this doesn't really exist in the world in this way. And I was trying to translate science that was completely unfamiliar to me and in the journalistic vein had just never been talked about before. So it was quite a fascinating process. And I am grateful to the few companies who did talk to me and were very transparent, actually. Yeah, like, the problems you're hearing about in a kind of abstract sense, we're definitely dealing with those now.
And what was the time? You said you found the paper, but what was actually the time difference between your paper being published and you finding it? Because I also remember it was kind of around, but it wasn't, like, out there. I don't know.
About 6 months.
Yeah.
6 months, wow. And had you heard stuff after you published it within those 6 months, or was it really only when Joe came along?
I didn't hear nothing, but nothing that was actionable or worth responding to.
Okay, interesting.
No.
And then what happened when your paper came out or your article came out? What was the reaction to that like?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, it was a very gratifying reaction. There were people from within the cultured meat community who I think were appreciative of some of the kind of more sobering aspects of Dave's analysis and of my reporting. George from VOW, who spoke earlier today, wrote what I thought was a really interesting and engaging and constructive piece about, like, okay, I'm sitting in a place where it sounds like I would want to kind of, push back against this story, but actually I agree with a lot of it. And here's why, and here's how that represents an opportunity. There were some exceptions to that. I think there was a kind of, my motivation for doing the piece was like, if we want to talk about this technology and its potential, we should be clear-eyed about what the reality is and not just simply basking in the realm of wishful thinking. And I felt like a lot of folks from within the community really kind of met the piece there and was like, cool, if this is the truth, like we want to know it. So in general, I was very gratified by the response, and I've had a lot of very interesting conversations since.
Yeah, one of the, you may remember in my welcome remarks, I talked about how I feel like the criticism in cellular agriculture is kind of like thin. It's like, no, it's unnatural, or it just keeps meat going, or things like that. But I feel like this was criticism that was actually incredibly constructive. I mean, even Dave's conclusions was actually like, you should do this, this, and this, not this doesn't work, and this doesn't work. It was actually laying out a roadmap for the science. And I think in some ways it's two different ways of reading the same thing. A lot of people would fund a roadmap to cellular agriculture, which is ultimately what this is, I think. And I'm curious, like, if you feel like people have used it that way, or they feel like they've taken it that way, or do you think it has been really framed as criticism to you?
I know some people have explicitly framed it as like, yes, and Dave's work more than mine, of like, this is a roadmap. This you can look at it as this damning document, but you can also look at it as like an incredibly sort of erudite guide to here's where the challenge areas are, right? So I've definitely heard that framing, but I don't know if you have thoughts.
Well, it breaks down onto one or the other, as far as I can tell. That there have been a sector of developers who have taken it to heart and said, yes, these are very good things. And there's a sector of developers that have said, he doesn't know what he's talking about. So that's kind of a handy rubric for me anyway on who's doing this in good faith. Yeah, I have presented what are real challenges. The road mapping thing is something I've gotten to think about more lately. I haven't seen one proposed yet, but I do think about it in much broader terms than what the technical issues that I highlighted. That there are more that I didn't highlight. There are going to be more about scaling up amino acids, scaling up the supply chain, potentially designing hydrolysates that are much cheaper than de novo amino acids. There's the DEI side of the whole thing. There's the LCA sustainability side of the whole thing. There are many working groups that have unsolved problems here, not just the stuff that I highlighted.
Yeah, from my own experience, someone asked me what I thought of the Humbird paper, and I was like, how many pages is it? I have not read it. So instead I went to the fellows, and I was like, what do you guys think of this paper? And they were like, this is my favorite paper. It's like pinned to my whatever, wherever they pin papers. This is the thing that keeps inspiring me every day. So I have to say, you had a big fan club, like just within the fellow community, of laying that out, which is kind of interesting because I have been in, I don't know if I should be naming names like this right here, but I've been in contact with Open Philanthropy for a long time about supporting Selag, and I feel like they've long been on the fence about if Selag is the right move for animals and that kind of stuff, but, fair enough. But to hear that they funded this research as a means to decide if they were into Selag felt actually really aligned with what New Harvest does. Is we don't know the answer, but in order to go there, you have to advance the technology in a sense. So in a way, I'm going to tell them they did fund Selag because that paper has been so pivotal and useful for everybody. But I'm actually going to switch gears because I know there's going to be so many audience questions. I wanted to ask you, in all of these experiences, what worries you the most about the field?
I can go for it. I sit in a little bit of a different place, but what worries me is the way that my industry of journalism and storytelling has interfaced with the kind of hype machine around cell ag, and I think so far it's been in a way that's been largely not constructive. The way that we cover tech in general, outside of even, I'm not even being specific to biotech or to food tech, but like the kind of, when you look at gadgets, and the internet, and things related to that, it's this obsession with novelty, with sort of glitziness, with new features, with disruption as like, just simply a pure good, as opposed to something that's, disruptive, which could be good or bad, is not inherently good. And it's the kind of journalistic, organizations have really inherited that really uncritical kind of fanish, largely sort of scientifically illiterate view in their or that approach in terms of their writing on this stuff. And I think it's actually done companies a disservice as well, because they're able to focus on tastings and think pieces and all this stuff, and they've gotten kind of a free pass in terms of some of the more difficult questions. But the difficult questions are where the good is, right? Like, I mean, first of all, because there's no avoiding them, right? This is biology. We're going to face this stuff. It's inevitable. So you're just in denial if you're not dealing with it. But I think it's also an opportunity to educate the public and to kind of lean into some of these discussions instead of shrinking away from them. I think there's this fear of doing that I still don't fully understand. And maybe it is because people are squeamish when it comes to things that are new, especially when you're talking about replacing something as sort of intimate and culturally central as food. But I would like to see a lot more of kind of real, open, clear-eyed, good faith debate and discussion.
But where do you think that hype comes from? Like, who's to blame about the media going that way?
It's a really good question. Honestly, I think that I think it's sort of a two-way street. I mean, I think that I haven't seen even a lot of interest, honestly, in the part of media of even following these threads. I mean, I've been so gratified and delighted by the response to the piece. But the media's response to the piece has been odd. It's been to write a lot of the same kinds of pieces and then give like a throwaway line or paragraph or acknowledgement to it. And it's like, oh, there's so much journalistic potential here. Like, why aren't we following these threads? And so I can only believe that there's kind of an institutional block of some kind that is preventing news organizations from like actually going to where the story is.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who's followed this for many, many years, it used to be just the same story. Every few months, the exact same story. Back then, it was Frankenmeat, which I have not heard in years now. But now it's like very optimistic, but it is kind of the same story.
Yeah.
And yesterday, someone asked me, like, what's the best outlet for following this field? And I was like, actually, they asked me, what's the best media for following this field? I'm like, what kind of media are you talking about? But I actually agree with you. There hasn't really been one place to see like the whole path from beginning forward, and like to really understand the players and the differentiation and all that kind of stuff. It has been really piecemeal, and I even feel like Joe, the journalists are kind of like you, like they've written a piece or two, but there are very few people for whom it is their thing. Yeah.
Completely true. I can't think of a staff writer for whom this is the beat. Yeah.
I mean, you also said maybe the companies are part of it, but I would also want to call out the investors. Someone in the break just now said, "Isn't the elephant in the room the investors? Like, isn't that in a way, they're behind so many of these things?" When I talk to some companies, they're like, "Oh, we do this for investment." I feel like they kind of get a pass sometimes.
I agree completely. I mean, I think that, yeah.
Well, what worries me is almost the same thing. That I've prepared for you an academic study. I'm not an academic. Okay, I'm very aware of how startups work and the hype. The thing that's new about cultured meat or Selag is that where previously that hype and those overpromises and stuff would have been between the developer and their investor, now it's for everyone. Now, somewhere it was decided that Selag should live and die by public opinion.
Right. Well said. Interesting. Well, let's flip it to the other question then. So if that's what worries you, what gives you the most hope?
New harvest. And I'm not being facetious. I mean,
I didn't plant that.
Yeah, no, that was spontaneous. But seriously, and I don't mean just literally New Harvest, but if you think of New Harvest as kind of an orientation and an attitude that's bigger than New Harvest, it's the people who are willing to be critical, self-critical, ask difficult questions, take the long road, all this stuff. That gives me hope because it's real. That's the situation that we're in, and that's where the reality is, and that's where the hope lies.
I had a bunch of things that I would have added here. We saw yesterday a number of talks, a number of people that brought up collaborative research, pre-competitive collaborative research. And from my perspective, before I got into TEA, before I was at NREL, I was actually in the semiconductor industry. And there's precedent for this in the semiconductor industry. When chip makers in the early 90s realized that the things that they had made were so strong, they weren't breaking, and they weren't selling anymore, they got together and recognized that if they were going to continue to scale and sell more chips, they were going to have to get on the same page. So what happened in the early 90s was the formation of a roadmap organization. It's called the International Technology Roadmap for Semiconductors. And for 30 years, it basically enforced Moore's Law. If there was a cop on Moore's Law, they were enforcing it. The way you participated was to let go of some of your IP. You had to basically understand that your competitors were doing some of the same things you were doing to make chips, but that by giving that up, you could be part of this organization, which was really driving the general technology forward, and then you go compete on overhead and tiny innovations in the margin, et cetera, just like they teach you in business school. Now, when that happened in the early 90s, semiconductors had already been around for 30 years. Does Selag have 30 years to wait until that point where they all get together, stop being so precious about the IP, and maybe get on the same page? I was in a meeting with Professor Kaplan in January. He was giving me his 10-year plan, and I blew his mind when I said that, synthetic biology for biofuels came and went in 10 years. And we don't know where we are on that arc with Selag. Mark Postberger was 9 years ago.
So we have 1 year left.
Maybe.
Well, I find those very hopeful as answers because I'm hopeful because you are both here. I think different people may not have reached out and wanted to actually come back here. I think, Dave, you muse now that you have nothing to do with Selag anymore.
None of my current projects are, no.
Right. So why are you even here today?
Oh, I have a soft spot for New Harvest, right? That support New Harvest, everyone. Yeah. New Harvest Fellows were some of the first to embrace the analysis. I think Natalie contacted me on the next day after it came out, which was like New Year's Eve or something. And then slowly, Mira was very interested in being my friend as well. And then, but so slowly the fellows and the leadership sort of brought me in, communicating with them, with the fellows. The New Harvest Fellows, to their credit, they recognized in my study that it was not fatalistic. They didn't embark on epic takedowns and commission hasty counter studies. Mm-hmm. But they did and say that, yeah, this is a way to approach the problem that's not monumentally naive, right? Mm-hmm. And so they gave me an in to help them understand it and apply it to their own work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're actually going to switch the Slido questions because I'm sure there are some questions that are a little more technical that I'm not in a position to ask myself. But let's get those going. In the meanwhile, I wanted to actually add that Dave was talking about the semiconductor industry and this kind of path forward. He's co-authored a paper with us that's going to be coming out in Nature Food in a couple months. It's focused on what does Selag look like as a race to market versus a race to mission, and it tries to kind of point out what are some different ways we could approach Selag to really achieve the mission aspect. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Let's go to our number one question. I'm seeing what Kate was seeing, very small text. No, I'm not going to ask that question. If you had to work at a cultured meat company, which one would it be? We decided we're not going to name names on stage today, but I would ask the question, have you considered genetic engineering in your analysis?
Not per se, not explicitly, but in the end, the fictional cell line that I had to assume in order to reach reasonable cell density without catabolite inhibition is not natural. So it's implied.
Sorry, I was kind of focused on the Slido.
No.
So you said it is implied that genetic engineering will have to be part of
I
it.
think it's implied, yeah. You'd have to have done something to get to that level of efficiency.
Interesting. Another person asks, what do you think about starting a scientific journal where the objective analysis and critiques are encouraged to build the field? That is actually interesting because in some ways your critique could not have happened without his critique.
Agreed.
Yeah, so I'm curious what you think. Is that a
You need a
missing
job.
infrastructure piece? No one's figured out how to make journals profitable, though. So
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Is this a question for me or
No,
for
I
Dave?
don't. I am in a completely different sector of my life. I've been dealing 6 months trying to get a 10-page paper published and rejected 3 times. And so I don't have positive things to say about publications at the moment.
Yeah.
that's something that needs to be opened for sure.
Yeah.
But actually, maybe I'll flip it to you. Like Joe, we mentioned no one has taken on Selag as their beat yet. You know, how do we actually incentivize that? Maybe outside of the scientific realm, like what would it take for there to be a real like Selag media outlet that is worth following, that does go deeper than what we've seen?
Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, and I think a lot of the issues I was talking about before are also tend to be true of food media in general too, where there's some incredible work happening, and yet there's also food journalism I think is seen by some as like an oxymoron still. It very much comes out of, at least if you look at the kind of like the food writing that's published through the lens of lifestyle, through the lens of culture, all of that can be great. But what's really needed, just the way the very idea of Selag kind of breaks down barriers and requires collaboration and diverse stakeholders and all of it. I think that kind of media that's dynamic and nimble and interdisciplinary and really rigorous is what's needed to take on this topic. And in fact, you don't see that a lot. I think that media is very segmented into its verticals, and this is in order to cover this, you have to kind of know a lot about a lot. And so how do we get there is a bigger question, but I think that's what's needed.
That actually really reminds me of what people used to ask me, why doesn't the government fund Selag? And I'd say it's because the USC is over there, NIH is over there, and NSF is over there, and Selag is kind of in the center of those things. So I'm kind of hearing that. But related to government funding, we have a question that is, Joe, one of your conclusions was to not put public funding towards the industry. Do you still believe that?
So yes and no. I mean, I feel like it's premature for the government to be putting, huge amounts of money into scaling Selag. I think what's needed a lot more now is public money into public open source research, right? I think that, and we can talk about like the VC model, but I feel that that's misaligned with the goals of Selag ultimately, to have these locked down, highly proprietary companies trying to be unicorns by VCs that want a 10x return is the wrong potentially fit for this, because best case scenario, then we have a monopoly, like 2 companies win, right?
But you said it's okay for the government to fund open source research. It's not good for them to fund the scaling stuff.
I just don't know that we're there yet.
But I'm curious, Dave, if you think those are even 2 separate different things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I'm from the Department of Energy Infrastructure. That's my, that's what I know. Coming out of the National Lab System, I just got done teaching plant design, right? And you don't. I learned, you don't go to college to learn scale up. The university can't afford that size of a reactor. You don't go to college to learn TEA even. So the role of the government ends up being funding the national labs to give you access to experts that do TEA and big bioreactors or big equipment, let's just say, in general. But the national labs in the U.S. are run by the DOE, and whatever this is, it ain't DOE. Right. So short of finding a new way to amalgamate some of the agencies into a Selag agency, and then start their own national labs or build equipment within the DOE labs. I mean, I just don't see where they put the money. However, what I will say is that having a roadmap organization or having an industry group that is on the same page and sort of objective about everything will go a long way towards establishing that, because in the end, the government is accountable to Congress and the public. Sorry, the government, an agency like a new funding agency would be accountable to Congress and ultimately the people. Along with that comes peer reviews and comes audits. So what they really need at the end, it would be helpful if you could hand them a set of metrics that they can judge you on when they march you in front of peer review, right? That's all it comes down to. So if you were to do that yourself, as a group, go a long way.
Yeah, I mean, that ties very well back to the infrastructure talk on the first day. Is like, we really actually need to create the structures for these groups to come together. But I will challenge you a little bit, Joe, on that question of scaling versus not scaling, especially because Dave said the genetic engineering of the cell line itself is part of scaling. So can you really actually pull scaling out of pre-competitive research? I personally don't think you can. And instead, pre-competitive is more about the source of funding than it is the outcome that you're looking for.
I can see that. I think the other aspect of why I put that in the piece, again, if the rationale for Selag is simply as a climate change kind of silver bullet, which again, it's some of the framing that we often hear in the media that I think is reductive. I'm not sure that makes sense until we have like a national renewable energy grid that can actually power facilities like the kind we're talking about, especially in rural locations. It doesn't exist, right? And without that infrastructure in place, Selag is not necessarily like a climate win. And so to me, that's a prerequisite for a lot of this. So that was the specific context in which I was saying that. Now, there are other reasons for supporting Selag beyond just trying to solve climate change. And actually, I think that's part of the thing that I think, my industry should embrace is what are those other reasons beyond just trying to like fix the climate, because they are out there and they lead to interesting conversations.
The one thing that in my analysis, there's a couple of individually necessary but insufficient things that have to happen, right? One of them is creating new media sources of amino acids, not from fermentation or from petrochemicals, like soy hydrolysate or whatever legume. Don't get hung up on soy, but some plant hydrolysate that ends up having enough free amino acids to cheaply grow cells. You can't, in my analysis, you can't get there without that. And I do see like that's something that obviously could be worked out at the academic level. It could be done with public funding. It would be somewhere to start. And much like solar and wind and renewables, we won't get there without that. So why not do that first?
I think that's a good example of some of the reservations that I have is like, do we really just want to slot Selag into the existing system? Do we really just want it to be a more kind of efficient consumer of commodity corn and soy with all of the problems that come kind of bundled in with that existing status quo? And I would argue that for Selag to be truly transformative, it shouldn't necessarily just be completely hooked into that.
But I mean,
system.
Selag also is not the only thing changing.
Yeah.
I'd like to think. So it's like, why do you say we should do the energy stuff first, and why can't we do it together, especially if Selag has a ways to go?
I haven't talked to anyone over there, but I'm sure they're probably having meetings right now about how they can't get it done. So, where it's resource allocation. I don't want to get too detailed, but it's resource allocation in my mind.
Okay. So I actually wanted to ask this question. So both of you, did you receive any criticisms or new pieces of data that changed your view post-publishing the article in the TEA?
I have to say no, I didn't really go seek them out either. The one assumption that I would have changed or thought more about, I think, is, well, in the analysis, I scale everything out to about 100,000 tons of cell mass per year, assuming that that is consistent with 10 million people consuming that stuff. And if I come out at a cost that's too high, it's inconsistently high with 10 million people, then I called that a fail. But and that volume is consistent with today, at least in 2018, kind of the volume of plant-based, the ascendant plant-based material, the Impossible Burger, the Beyond. What I maybe didn't appreciate was that those products are loss leaders still. I assumed that they had gone up to that kind of scale and were kind of making at least a little bit of a profit, but now I know that to not be true. I still think my argument holds, right? If we project, reduce our costs of capital and amino acids and whatever, and assume automation, et cetera, that's consistent with a large scale, 100,000 tons per year, we're gonna have to, the numbers have to give us a cost that's consistent with that level of consumption. Scale's not just about buying the biggest bioreactor, right? It's about selling everything to people.
Yep.
If you're not selling, there's no justification for that big bioreactor.
Well said.
Yeah, for my part, yeah, I had a real fear when the piece came out that some company would kind of raise their hand and be like, oh, well, we're doing this thing that turns all these assumptions on their head. And that never happened. And since then, I've had a lot of, really interesting conversations, both sort of on and off the record with people doing this work. And those conversations have only led to me to believe that, that Dave's work was even more accurate and incisive than I had even appreciated at the time. So that has been very gratifying. The challenges are real. People are struggling with them now. And I think, again, it only benefits everyone just to kind of be upfront about that and enlist others in the journey of, like, how do we crack this code and do this truly transformative thing. I think one point that's really important to make, and you actually made this in the piece, Isha, which was great, is that, we can talk about this sort of price threshold and why this is so hard for this technology to meet, but also we shouldn't take for granted that that's going to stay the same, right? Traditional, conventional meat consumption is only going to become more expensive, more damaging as resources become scarcer and scarcer. And so it is a moving target. And as things change in ways that we can't even foresee now, perhaps there are ways that Selag will look more attractive in ways we can't yet foresee. So I think that's important to underscore.
Yeah, I actually wanted to come back to the point you made before this one, which was about how there are other outcomes for Selag besides these climate ones, and how those other ones could be very transformative in their own right. And I'm curious what you think some of those outcomes could be, and maybe what is like the minimum viable impact that Selag could have if nothing worked. Like, I'm curious what we could get out of all of this if we are, if we only have a year left, for example.
Wow. Well, I think, part of it, honestly, is like just the idea of, I think this is a technology that forces us to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want? How do we want to relate to food? Because essentially, it's sort of a blank slate or a reset. I think this is a technology that is really coming from the ground up and has us, that's both the challenge and the opportunity of it. Is like we have to rethink everything, and that's good. That's an opportunity to say, what do we hate about the way the world exists now as currently structured, and how might we structure it differently? And that's my fear about Selag. Like, when I look at the dark side of it, is like, oh, okay, this is, one company's gonna have a major breakthrough and there'll be a total monopoly, and then the food system will be even more consolidated than it is now. And as we know, monopolies tend not to have a good impact on human beings when it comes to food and critical resources like food. So that's my fear, right? But my hope, and the thing that gets me excited, is like, oh, but we might blow up these existing paradigms that are doing so much harm now. So I don't know if I have a specific thing as much as just like, that's the radical potential of this, is it forces us to ask the all-critical question and ask ourselves that question.
What about you, Dave? What do you think minimum viable impact is?
That is the... specific product I can't name, but that is an important part of what I say. I say this about biofuels all the time. Like, it was naive to think we could go right to fuels without making something more valuable. So it's, and the companies that were doing synthetic biology for fuels in the 2000s, if they're still in business today, you look at what they're doing and it's not fuels. It's very
Creams.
It's
face
yes,
creams.
cosmetics, personal care, fragrances, flavors, high value stuff. So again, this has come. Here we are, where everyone's been promised new food, but maybe commodity food's not the first application for this. So where flavors are more important. I don't know. My mind quickly goes to, like, why are we doing this at all? But
Well, I mean, I actually kind of thought you were going to go there, because sometimes I'm constantly reevaluating, do I still like this thesis? Does it still make sense to me? And every so often I meet someone who became a vegetarian because of Selag, who like wasn't on the PETA track, or wasn't, like all the other kind of reasons to not eat meat didn't resonate. And when I think about when I started with New Harvest 8, 9, some long time ago, very little people, like, there was so much background you had to give about why we wanted to reinvent meat, just explaining why meat sucked and why animal agriculture was actually really dangerous and not something we should invest in. And so for me, a minimum viable impact is just getting everyone on the same page about that. Like, I think that alone is so huge. And then whatever solution we come to probably will be one less engineered in the near term, but that's a great place for a lot of people to land if they weren't going there before.
I think that's really well said. I agree. Like, the idea that we don't have to accept the world as it stands, that there is an alternative, I think, is in and of itself radical and powerful, and that's really cool.
Did you want to say anything more about that?
no thanks.
So I have another question here. Has Selag as a whole overpromised on the timelines that are achievable? Is this the elephant in the room? And if you remember, there is no elephant in the room. But yes, what do you think about the timelines?
That's fair to say, right? I showed Joe. I was looking at some old article, Food Navigator or whatever, and at the bottom, I think it was from 2018, 16. It was an old one. So, and at the bottom of it was Upside Foods, Memphis Meats, at 6 people promising a product in 2018.
I thought we weren't going to name names.
Yeah. Well, it's an old story, right? So, not to hang everything on one company, but.
Well, on that point, actually, at the 2017 New Harvest Conference, I was on a panel with Vince, who's a regulatory guy, and at the time another company had promised a product on the market at the end of this year, and he made the same conclusion, like just the regulatory pathway was going to prevent that from happening. So it isn't naming one name, it's come up.
No, it's the supply chain as well. I mean, when there's this arms race about bioreactor size, and some of the numbers that are thrown around today, 250,000 liter bioreactor, our amino acid, our media and consumable supply chain is years away from supporting even one of those guys. So this ain't a scene, it's a goddamn arms race.
Well, I wanted to touch on the timelines thing, because we always have this debate about what should we call it. What should we call it? The thing is, we actually haven't defined what it is. So the timelines are really dependent on what we decide cultured meat is. Is it a plant-based thing with a couple of cells sprinkled on it? Okay, let's talk about the timeline for that. It's also, so we haven't defined what it is, and then we also haven't defined the timeline, like, is on the market, what is on the market? Like, that seems like that could be unpacked to many levels as well.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It's like, what is the timeline? What is the goal of the timeline? Like, what is a meaningful achievement or accomplishment, right? Is it just someone getting FDA approval? You know, is it a minimal amount of, you know, product on the market? You know, when does this actually start to matter? And I think, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I also didn't mean to say like the plant-based thing with 2 cells was a bad thing. I actually think that's an awesome thing.
Well, but that's
Yeah.
the debate we should be having,
Yes.
right? Is like, is that meaningful? And if so, why? As opposed to just kind of like looking at every successive thing in a vacuum and being like, well, this is unprecedented, amazing. Like, let's help people. Let's contextualize what these milestones actually mean and think critically about which ones are important.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask this question. What is your opinion on the 2 other TEAs about Selag that have been published?
Unfortunately, I think I don't care for them. Well, let me. Those and anything else that was done apart and before my study, it changed the way. It kind of formed the way I even did my approach, because everything before mine started out as an apology for growth factors, right? The analysts would start out their analysis and finally come to the point where they had to go cost growth factors for their OpEx and say, oh, shit, we can't afford that. And so the rest of the article or the analysis would turn into an apology for that, and then wave hands, voila, cultured meat. And meanwhile, they would get the rest of the analysis wrong. They would have unphysical cell densities. These 2 that are named, they each had the problem of 100% cell density in the bioreactor. So no room for anything else. So fundamental things about the TEAs would be wrong. At the same, in my mind, growth factors are the amount that we need is so small. Why are we going to let them push us around, right? If with available scaling laws, you can show that if recombinant proteins could scale like subtilisin or, you know, hydrolytic enzymes for industry, those costs will vanish at scale. So let's scale them out and shut up about them. What are the remaining engineering challenges? They end up being capital costs associated with adequate sterility. Amino acid costs do not scale quickly enough like proteins do. So amino acid costs at appropriate scale and quality, and then metabolic efficiency as it impacts attainable cell density. So those are nothing to do with growth factors.
When you said 100% cell density, our researcher over there was
Huh?
like, yeah. She's like, how is that possible?
Yeah. Imagine a bioreactor full of cells, but nothing else.
Like a cow. Yeah. So we only have 2 minutes left, even though I want to, 2.5 minutes, even though I want to keep chatting about that. And I actually wanted to leave on the note of, you know, given all that you've seen and what you know, do you have a call to action for the people in the room today? I think you have a sense of who's in the room. What would you want them to take away from what you've learned?
Yeah, my first call to action, and this is just a quick one, is like, hi, I'm here, like, please get in touch. Like, I would love to hear from all of you about your research, about your work, about what's hard about it, about what's great about it. I take what you do really seriously, and I would love to learn from anyone in this room. So easily findable on the internet. Please, you know, be part of the stories I'm trying to tell. I think in a larger sense, my thing would probably be, you know, lean into the complexity. Trust the public. I'll tell just like a quick kind of story, which is, you know, I've talked to a lot of people who were involved with, you know, the early phase of GMOs, you know, in the 80s and the 90s. And a big regret that I think the folks involved with that technology had was it was very top down. It was like, let's just kind of push this into the supply chain, push it into the world, not think about the public, and just we'll kind of just roll with it. And I think folks came to really regret the lack of transparency there, because it led to this rise of I mean, there's a lot of problems, right, with the way too that the systems were built around that. But with, you know, there was a public backlash essentially. And I think that this industry could face a similar situation if it does not, you know, engage in good faith with the public. So that would be mine is trust people, trust their ability for complexity, and have real conversations.
Well said.
Stop being so precious. I mean, that is something I mentioned earlier. You will have to get on the same page at some point. And you may not have 30 years to develop and make money in the meantime. If this is really so important, and I feel it is. Maybe Selag doesn't fit in my worldview, but to be consistent, synthetic biology does. So I am hopeful about synthetic biology applications to enhance, improve food system existing or otherwise. But to do it in secret and individually is not a winner.
And to that point, getting on the same page is going to be a lot easier now than later. I mean, after certain precedents and things are set, it's going to be a lot harder to all come together. But with that, I'd love to give our guests a round of applause. What a wonderful conversation. And I guess, do I pass it back to you, Kristen, or I'll just... Oh, but don't we have a coffee break? Yeah, so we have a very quick coffee break, and then we're going to have the very also important town hall right at the top of the hour, at 30 minutes in. So please come back in time for that. I'd say try to make it back at 25. I think it's going to be an awesome discussion. Thank you so much.